his own. His inquiries are directed towards ethics and nothing else. On the other hand, the Socrates of the middle and late dialogues, by contrast, is dogmatic, constructive, committed to metaphysical, epistemological, scientific, and political, as well as ethical theories. It's a plausible and widely held interpretation of these facts that the Socrates of the early dialogues represents the historical Socrates, while that of the middle and late dialogues serves as a mouthpiece for Plato's views. I shall assume this interpretation and examine what Socrates' apparently destructive or perhaps deconstructive approach to philosophy has to teach us. Consider one set of paradoxical claims that seems to be held by the historical Socrates. 1, virtue is knowledge. 2, Socrates has no special knowledge. 3, virtue is not teachable. 4, Socrates' only method of gaining knowledge is a negative one of refutation, the so-called elenchus. And point 5, the 4 doctrinal points here, 1 to 4, are both individually and taken together counterintuitive at best, and hence highly problematic, as Socrates recognizes and almost delights in pointing out. Taken in conjunction with the exemplary life of Socrates, they seem unable to account for it. There is one Platonic dialogue that explores in depth Socrates' philosophical method, the Gorgias. This dialogue seems to present Socrates at his most argumentative and ill-tempered. It perhaps expresses Plato's own exasperation at posthumous attacks on Socrates. In this dialogue, Plato lays out what he sees as the method in Socrates' madness, and what he shows us makes a good deal of sense, notwithstanding Plato's choleric tone. So with some help from Plato, we'll try to understand Socrates' philosophical method, and hopefully the connection between his thought and his life. One thing that's striking about Socrates' philosophical method is the narrow way he practices it, one-on-one with a single partner. Often there are onlookers, and sometimes, as in the Protagoras, Euthydemus, and Gorgias, a large audience. But Socrates still focuses on one single interlocutor. In the Gorgias, he ends up having discussions with 3 different interlocutors, Gorgias, Polus, and Callicles, but always one at a time, refuting each in turn. In Republic 1, he converses with Cephalus, Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus, one after another. And unlike what teachers and especially philosophers typically do, Socrates does not offer his own truths and argue for them, although he sometimes tentatively offers his beliefs, especially when they disagree with those of a wise man. But he extracts all of his theses to be discussed from his interlocutors. If he's asked what he thinks about important things, he often answers that he doesn't know. What do you think? Moreover, Socrates is serious about discussing what his interlocutors believe. He typically insists that the interlocutor give his own beliefs, not some hand-me-down assertion from a famous thinker. When Meno, a student of the famous sophist Gorgias, offers to give his master's view about virtue to Socrates, Socrates insists that he say what his own views are, even if they happen to agree with those of Gorgias. To Thrasymachus, he says, please don't answer contrary to your own beliefs so that we may get somewhere. Unlike almost every other philosopher, Socrates doesn't philosophize in pure generalities, and he doesn't examine propositions disembodied from the people who hold them. His argumentation is almost always ad hominem or directed towards an individual. And the premises he uses are almost always ex homine, extracted from an individual. Socrates sometimes suggests a line of inquiry when the interlocutor is stuck, but he then asks if that suggestion seems right to the other person. Thus, Socrates is always examining not only ideas, but also the person who holds those ideas. As the general Nicias says in one dialogue, speaking from experience, you obviously don't know that anyone who gets close enough to Socrates to converse with him must eventually go around and around with Socrates in argument and not stop until the man ends up giving a complete account of how he lives now and how he has spent his past life. Socrates' own method is thus highly personal. It's concerned with definitions of ethical virtues, but it's directed towards some person in particular and how he understands and ultimately practices virtue. Socrates points out to Nicias, Laches, Lysimachus, and Lysias that to talk about instilling virtues in young men is in fact to concern ourselves with the boys' souls. And this is just what Socrates says is his message to the Athenians, to exhort them to give their greatest attention to the care of their souls, rather than of their bodies or possessions. Socrates' method is designed precisely to hit home to the soul of the person he's examining. Socrates is not talking about virtue in the abstract, but about how his partner in conversation stands with respect to virtue. His interlocutor needs to understand virtue, but also to live his life in accordance with the correct understanding. What then is a soul? The Greeks have been talking about soul in some form since the time of Homer, at least. Philosophers in particular saw the soul as the home of thought and reason. Plato would write extensive discourses on soul, and Aristotle would write an almost modern-sounding treatise on psychology to elucidate the soul. But Socrates, even though he often mentions soul and speaks of it as the most important part of us, offers no formal theory of soul. And yet much of his ethical theory presupposes truths about soul, without which his explicit theorizing would make no sense. So let's create a model of soul for Socrates. A model doesn't have to tell us everything about the object it represents. In science, models often simplify complex phenomena such as the structure of the atom or patterns of weather for the purpose of understanding and prediction. So here we go. Similarly, Socrates doesn't concern himself with all aspects of soul. He specifically disavows knowledge of the afterlife, if any, of the soul, a subject that Plato is at pains to clarify. And in the Phaedo, for instance, right? Socrates has nothing to say about the metaphysical constitution of the soul, or the metaphysical relationship of soul to body, topic on which Plato and Aristotle discourse at length. He is, however, interested in the soul as the locus of selfhood and the seat of reason. Our thinking and reasoning are activities belonging to that part of us that is called soul, psyche in modern terms, mind. Socrates' method is wholly concerned with our reasoning about moral decision-making and action. So he does take a philosophical interest in the content of our thought. Socrates holds a view that I call agathism, the doctrine that everyone acts so as to bring about the good. This point constitutes a major principle of soul. Soul acts on desire. Desire is directed toward the good. Socrates distinguishes between real good and apparent good. He holds that what ultimately motivates us is the real good, not specious imitations. But given that we are by nature oriented toward the true good, every person is identical to every other person in his or her basic motivations. My soul differs from yours not in basic motivation or impulse. When Meno defines virtue as the desire to desire good things and to be able to get them, Socrates points out that as a matter of fact, no one desires evil. Hence, Socrates rejects the first half of the definition. So to want good things, which you mention in your definition, belongs to everyone. And in this respect, no person is better than any other. He holds that the virtuous and the vicious person do not differ in their basic desires, so it's vain to build desiring into the definition of virtue. Okay. Now, the only way that my soul can differ from yours is in our respective understandings of the world. What differs from soul to soul is the beliefs that different individuals hold. From this point of view, what makes me, me, and what makes you, you as a soul is just the beliefs we severally hold. Every soul is, from this perspective, a set of beliefs. The soul includes the innate desire for the good, of course, but the motivation is invariable and hence unhelpful in evaluating different souls. Some beliefs are true, some are false. Beliefs about different things. Some are about who we are. Some are scientific beliefs about the nature of the world and how it works. Some are about people, some are about politics, and some are about what is right and wrong, good and evil. Beliefs of the last kind, as we can see on numerous occasions, are the most important for Socrates, and evidently the most contentious ones for people. In recent philosophy, value judgments are often taken to be problematic insofar as there are significant disagreement between individuals, groups, and cultures about what is right and wrong, and little objective evidence to adjudicate such disagreements. Indeed, Socrates recognizes this problem. Quote, concerning what we do differ, what do we differ and fail to come to agreement? He asks Euthyphro, so that we lose our tempers and become hostile to each other. See if it isn't what is right and wrong, noble and base, good and evil. Aren't these the very things concerning which we differ and can't agree on, so that we become hostile, whatever we do, both you and I and all other people? Socrates recognizes the problematic nature of value judgments, but he doesn't for that reason dismiss them, what some contemporary philosophers would say are mere expressions of feeling or matters of taste. Rather, he takes them as beliefs that are like opinions about facts, either true or false. If there's one fundamental desire, namely for the good, which is the same for all people, what is variable between person and person is not that fundamental desire, but the beliefs they hold. Some people, those who have the right beliefs, do the right thing so as to realize the good. Some people who have the wrong beliefs do the wrong thing so as to fail to realize the good. What then is the difference between right and wrong beliefs? Evidently for Socrates, the difference centers on the value judgments. Some people have false beliefs about what's good and evil. We've seen that virtue can be understood as the knowledge of what is good and evil, and so the correct understanding of what Socrates calls the most important things is that one. Okay. Now let's look at an egregious example of moral failure. As a citizen soldier, I march into battle firm in the conviction that I must stay at my post and obey the orders of my superior officers. In the heat of battle, however, I am seized with fear. I throw down my shield and flee my post. The standard common sense response is that I'm guilty of weakness of will. My will was unable to resist the passion of fear, and so I committed a cowardly deed. For Socrates, however, there is no weakness of will. Cowardice is ignorance of what is and is not to be feared. The source of my problem is a clash of beliefs. I say that I should man my post and obey orders, but I flee my post and disobey orders. So I say one thing and do another. Why? Not because I was seized with an overpowering irrational emotion, but because I believed that what was false. I believed that death was the worst of all evils, the very belief that Socrates said was the most reprehensible ignorance. But why, when I said I believed that it was my duty, did I believe that death was the worst of all evils? Because in fact, I held the latter view all along. The opinion that I should stay at my post and obey orders, and the opinion that death is the worst of all evils, are not ostensibly incompatible. But when I'm in a situation of danger on the battlefield, the latter opinion comes into conflict with the former. In fact, the former opinion presupposes that death is not the worst of all evils, and so I can't logically maintain both beliefs at the same time. What looks like an instance of weaknesses of will for Socrates is salient evidence of the inconsistency of beliefs. There's another way to test souls that is less embarrassing for the soul than what occurs on the battlefield or in the heat of the moment. That is to ask questions about the person's beliefs. In the process of questioning, a sensitive questioner can bring out the beliefs of the individual, especially by probing the implication of those beliefs. And the person being tested says one thing, but then says something else beside that, incompatible with it. On the most important questions, we have prima facie evidence that the soul of the individual is harboring incompatible beliefs. The soul of a good person does the right thing because it's made up of all true beliefs, which are consistent with each other. The soul of the bad person often does the wrong thing because it's made up of both true and false beliefs, which contradict each other. So a good soul is logically consistent, while a bad soul harbors inconsistent beliefs. So let's turn to the Gorgias now and see how the method works in practice, at least according to Plato. In a dispute with Polus about whether the unjust tyrant is happy, Socrates criticizes the sophistic practice of multiplying illustrious authorities for a thesis, pointing out that they may all be false witnesses. I, Socrates continues, though I am just one, do not agree with you. For you can't make me agree, though you may banish me from my possessions, namely the truth, by calling up many false witnesses against me. And unless I can call up you yourself as a single witness to confirm my case, I can accomplish nothing worthwhile in the debate. Neither can you unless I, as a single witness, confirm your case, for you can forget all your other witnesses. In other words, Socrates is confident that after a cross-examination, Polus will end up agreeing with Socrates and not vice versa, thus proving that Socrates is right. Socrates goes on to say that he's not good at taking votes, as his experience with the council showed, but, quote, I do know how to produce one witness of my case, the individual with whom I'm conversing. I pay no attention to the many since I don't converse with them, but I do know how to poll the one. So see if you're willing to take the role of witness and be cross-examined by answering some questions. For I myself, I maintain that you and I and every person believes that committing injustice is worse than suffering injustice, and not being punished for a crime is worse than being punished. Socrates makes clear this view that truth is not discovered by democratic means. As he argues with Crito in another place, what counts is not how many people hold an opinion, but the expert opinion and the truth itself. Socrates' method is not legislative, but judicial. And even in a judicial setting, he's not counting witnesses, but examining the individual witness for his consistency and hence veracity. Socrates' notion of success is being able to show how the hostile witness really agrees with him after all. By asking a series of questions on cross-examination, Socrates will get Polus to assent to Socrates' paradoxical theses about wrongdoing and punishment. In an argument ex homine and ad hominem, Socrates measures success by his ability to elicit agreement with his position from the interlocutor. The more recalcitrant the witness, the better is the proof. When Polus agrees, Socrates will have established quod erat demonstrandum. Further, Socrates holds that everyone really believes the paradoxical propositions Socrates advances provocatively. Polus provides an especially difficult challenge, but he's not, according to Socrates, any different from anyone else in his fundamental beliefs. We will have to address the reason for this ambitious claim by Socrates later, but he does seem to adhere to this universal account elsewhere. For instance, Socrates tells Protagoras that he thinks that no wise man would say that people do wrong willingly, And yet tells his accuser Meletus at the trial that neither Meletus nor anyone else thinks people do wrong willingly. Clearly, Protagoras, Meletus, and many others would beg to differ. But Socrates would say they really agree with him because in a cross-examination, he can elicit agreement from each one of them on this point, based solely on the person's individual beliefs. In the Gorgias, Socrates refutes Polus and then faces an even more intransigent opponent in Callicles. Continuing a debate about the value of justice, he says, "Don't be shocked that I say such things, but stop my beloved Socrates, my beloved philosophy, from saying them. For she is the one, my dear friend, who utters the words you now hear coming from me. Philosophy always says the same things, and she says what you are now shocked at, and you heard her speeches for yourself. So either refute her in the view that I now defended, that to commit injustice and having committed it to escape justice is the ultimate evil, or if you leave this view unrefuted, then Callicles will not agree with you, Callicles, but he will be out of tune with you for the rest of your life." Now, Socrates warns Callicles that the disputed thesis doesn't originate with Socrates, but with the discipline of philosophy. If Callicles objects, he will be taking arms against personified philosophy herself, or, in other words, the truth. He will be out of tune with himself by disagreeing with himself about important matters. He'll be harboring a contradiction that he'll carry around with himself until he acknowledges the evils of injustice and, in fact, the sovereignty of virtue. The evidence will be, we can infer that on cross-examination, Callicles will be forced to assent to Socrates' proposition that to commit injustice is the worst of evils. Socrates duly proceeds to refute Callicles out of the latter's own mouth and thus vindicates philosophy. In his earlier discussion with Gorgias, Socrates describes his openness to refutation. "What kind of person am I?" he asked. "I'm one who would gladly be refuted if I say something false, and who would gladly refute another if he says something false. But I would just as soon be refuted as to refute, for I consider it to be a greater good to be refuted, inasmuch as it is a greater good for one to be freed from the greatest evil than to free another. For I believe there is no greater evil for a person than to have a false judgment about the subjects we are now discussing." For Socrates, as we've seen, false opinions about what is right and wrong are the root of all moral evil. Contradictory statements and inconsistent behavior are evidence of false beliefs about values and of a state of logical inconsistency in the soul. As Socrates says to Crito, "So is life worth living with the body defective and ruined?" Not at all. But is life worth living with the part ruined which injustice harms and justice benefits? Or should we consider that part inferior to the body, whatever part of it is that is concerned with injustice? That part which is harmed by injustice and benefited by justice is plainly the soul. So if life is hardly worth living with a corrupt body, it's even less worth living with a corrupt soul. Having a corrupt soul is the worst of all evils for an individual. And having a corrupt soul is precisely having a soul full of falsehood and contradiction. A diseased soul is infected with false beliefs. How then can one be freed from the worst of all evils, inconsistency of soul? The answer should be obvious by now. The elenchus, if you will, the process of question and answer probing of the interlocutor's beliefs, practice of refutation, plays the role of identifying and expunging false beliefs from the individual, that is, from his or her soul. That's why Socrates is eager to be refuted, no less than to refute another. If his companions won't refute him, he'll even invent implacable interrogators like the personified laws of the Crito. Far from being a purely negative method, the elenchus, as Socrates practices it, is the means of testing souls for disease and corruption. If the questioner finds contradictions, he can inquire further and expose the folly of false beliefs and the cause of logical conflict. By repeated applications of logical inquiry, the interlocutor may be freed. As Socrates examines Polus, the champion of might makes right ethics. He advises him, don't shrink from answering Polus, it won't hurt. But kindly reply to the argument as you would respond to a doctor and say yes or no to my questions. The elenchus is positively therapeutic. It may cause some initial confusion and embarrassment as a doctor's treatment causes discomfort, but it delivers the interlocutor from psychic disease as the doctor delivers the patient from physical disease and chronic pain. We can see a modern parallel to Socrates' method and the method of psychoanalysis. According to Freudian theory, many of our psychic problems result from childhood traumas. We carry traces of them with us. A knowledgeable psychoanalyst can identify these problems for a patient, but that would do the patient no good. The patient has to discover the meaning of the event for himself or herself. Asking the right questions can unlock the truth, but the patient must discover the truth for himself or herself. Similarly, Socrates, the physician of soul, applies a kind of logic therapy to his patients. He asks questions about the most important things, typically about the several virtues and how the patient understands them. He tests the patient's answers against other beliefs the patient holds. If he finds an inconsistency, he pursues it until the problem becomes evident to the patient. His therapy is often, indeed typically, not completed in a single session. The inconsistency arises from deeply held notions that will require repeated probing to expose and discredit. If a session ends in aporia or puzzlement, that should provide an impulse for further discussions. If it doesn't, the patient is at fault for being content to remain in a confused and helpless state. The state of aporia is no more than the explicit recognition of what has been the case all along, that the patient holds an inconsistent set of beliefs. Socrates' method presupposes that we already have many true beliefs about the world and about moral values. Socrates does not envisage a case in which we have consistent but false beliefs about everything. On his model, when we accepted false belief, it inevitably clashes with our deeply held true beliefs to produce a contradiction. This then issues in contradictions in our actions and our statements about our actions. In the late dialogue, the sophist Plato reflects on the elenchic method, in the mouth of an anonymous visitor from Elia. The visitor explains that some people think the way to correct their children's behaviors by admonition and encouragement. On the other hand, other people consider all badness to be involuntary ignorance. So, just in this passage here, they interrogate anyone on points in which he thinks he is saying something when he's speaking nonsense. Then, since his views are confused, they will easily examine his views and collecting them from their discussions. They set them side by side and show that at the same time concerning the same things, the opinions oppose each other, advocating positions pro and con. The subjects who perceive this become upset with themselves and gentle toward the questioners. In this way, they are delivered from exaggerated and rigid opinions about themselves. Just as physicians of the body believe that the body is not able to enjoy nutrition, the nutrition they offer until they purge the substance impeding it. So those who purify people believe that the same applies to the soul. Now, again, Socrates in the Sophist, this late work, calls this a kind of noble sophistry and thinks it's the beginning of wisdom in philosophy, but you need to understand the forms and the theory of recollection and all these other things as well. But clearly he's describing Socrates' method here. Again, Plato likens activities of those who practice refutation. to the work of the physician. The final objective is to purge false belief, thus freeing the soul to have correct understanding of itself in its relation to the world. So this is all therapeutic. Now, building on the foundations of Socrates, that Socrates laid, Plato thinks refutation of false beliefs, the elenchus, forms a valuable part of one's philosophical education. But at least in his later life, he does not regard it as the whole of philosophical method, but rather as a preliminary step, kind of noble sophistry. One of the Socratic paradoxes is the conflict in saying that virtue is knowledge and saying that virtue is not teachable. On the present knowledge model, the paradox disappears. If the individual soul holds a set of beliefs, and virtue amounts to holding all relevant true beliefs, that is, beliefs about the most important things, and no relevant false beliefs. And if the soul of a mature individual already contains relevant true beliefs, then there is nothing for it to learn. The work of the examiner is not to instill new beliefs, not to teach in the conventional sense, but to rid the soul of the false beliefs that interfere with the true beliefs by contradicting them and confusing moral reasoning. The soul doesn't need to learn new truths about moral principles, but rather, in some cases, to unlearn false ones. This view suggests, moreover, however, that we need to understand how the true beliefs got into us in the first place. Plato has a good deal to say about this, starting in the Meno, where he introduces the doctrine of recollection of pre-existing knowledge, significantly as a way out of the puzzlement generated by Socrates' refutations. But Socrates himself has precious little to say about the origin of moral truth. And presumably this is why Plato sees the urgent need to supply a robust theory of knowledge that will account for the presence of moral truths in all human beings. But Socrates takes no interest in these further developments. His interest is purely in ethics and the most basic assumptions that justify ethical principles. Yet the past patchwork of paradoxical doctrines, assumptions, and methods we meet in the Socratic dialogues should now begin to emerge into a harmonious pattern that shows a logical mind behind the enigmas. There is truth in Socrates' disavowal of knowledge, in that he does not claim or need expert knowledge to attain virtue. Socrates has an account of moral psychology, according to which intellectualism is true. Virtue is knowledge, and the moral agent must possess the relevant knowledge. If so, we can see how Socrates' virtuous life embodies virtue in a guided practice of moral principles. What has been missing so far in our story is an appreciation of Socrates' negative method, which formerly seemed to offer only a way of exposing the follies of the interlocutor, maybe embarrassing people. Now we can see that according to Socrates' logical method of the soul, we are already endowed with moral principles. So the only moral guidance we need comes from an elimination of conflicts between true and false beliefs, which manifest themselves in contradictory statements and inconsistent actions. That the elenchus accomplishes in the form of a logical therapy to the soul. Okay. Contemporary students of Socrates often see him as searching diligently for valid definitions of virtue, but in vain. Socratic dialogues typically end in puzzlement rather than resolution of the question. And Socrates wanders off to try again with another hapless victim, only to fail again. He sees what it would take to turn ethics into a science, but he can never arrive at the promised land. So come to the academy, Plato seems to imply and find out what virtue is and how to attain it. But on the present interpretation, Socrates is eminently successful in doing just what he thinks needs to be done. He promotes virtue in the only way anyone can really promote it, by refuting moral falsehoods. If the logical model of soul is correct, practice of the elenchus is both necessary and sufficient for virtue. Thus, Socrates embodies a life of virtue and becomes a martyr to his gospel of ethical reform. Whatever we may think of his peculiar theory and his idiosyncratic method, there is method in his madness, and he succeeds in inspiring a generation of young thinkers to follow in his footsteps. Socrates invented the study of ethics as we know it and lived according to his principles, becoming the role model for a generation of followers. Thank you. And stop sharing. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. I'll be happy to make a list. We can start a queue. If you'd like to either raise your hand in the video or through Zoom, I will keep an eye on that. Looks like William.
I have a question about this related to the learner's paradox or the learner's argument that is crudely presented by Meno, a little bit more rigorously stated by Socrates himself, and ask you about in relationship specifically to virtue, because Meno raises the question. You know, he's back to the corner from all the argumentation in the first third of the dialogue Meno, that and now he says he's going to use this argument that Socrates labels as the debater's argument, that we really can't come to know what virtue is. So he presents the argument, either we know what virtue is or we don't know what virtue is. If we know what virtue is, we basically can't, you know, be taught it, come to learn it. If we don't know what it is, we still can't be, because we would never recognize it. Therefore, we cannot come to know virtue or virtually any other thing. Now, my question is this. I mean, some people construe what's going on there the following way. I mean, the argument form is a form of simple constructive dilemma, and so it's valid in terms of logic. Meno is surprised and says to Socrates, "Doesn't this seem sound to you?" And Socrates says, "No, it doesn't seem sound to me." Now, I don't know what I don't read the ancient Greek, what the Greek is, how it's being used there, but some people would construe this as then that although there's the statement about recollection and so on at the very beginning, the whole middle third of the Meno is to try and demonstrate that the argument, although is valid, the third premise is false, and that the slave boy illustrates that because he didn't know how to solve the geometric problem, and then he came to know that it's false. But might it not be, given what you've said here, is that Meno accepts the argument, and so does Socrates, but the interpretation they make of the argument is different. Meno's using it because apparently it's the type of argument that was in the kit bag of the sophists. But Socrates, he thinks he actually thinks from a ultimate view, with a right understanding of the argument, it's also correct that virtue can't be taught. Yeah. So have I made myself clear about how you give an account of that, and I'm interested in what you would say about that?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Bill. Yeah, it's a nice case, and I think it's kind of a turning point in the dialogues here, because the first half of the Meno is very Socratic, and the second half is a kind of lead into Platonic ideas. So it seems to me, what Socrates, which I take it is now sort of a more Platonic Socrates, says in the second half of the dialogue, is something like this. I'm going to show you that the slave boy already knows geometry. He just doesn't know he knows it. And so if I ask him all the right questions, he's going to get it. Now, of course, we see him as sort of asking these leading questions and so on. But I mean, it allegedly is a case of asking all the right questions and showing somebody that you really know the answers, you just don't know you know them. And so in a way, this supports the Socratic principle that you already know what virtue is, or what is good and evil, or something like that, that you already know that. Now, I take it that the theory of recollection is not Socrates' answer, however, how we have that. It's a very, well, metaphysically fraught way of getting to that, and religious, metaphysical, epistemological, and so on. But it is consistent in some way with that view. So it's a kind of Plato trying to help out Socrates and fill in the blanks, the gaps he sees in that argument. Yeah. And I think he does that. And again, I think he sees himself as, supplying what's missing he thinks ethics by itself won't be strong enough to work.
I mean, the ethical part of it is certainly really crucial for Socrates, because after he finishes with that middle third interlude with the slave boy, then what he really wants to insist on is even stronger than the geometric proof about how to double the area of a square, but is that, we shouldn't embrace the idea that we can't know things.
Yeah.
And he's more certain of this than anything. And they make then the moral conclusion is don't believe that, because that is damaging to the soul.
Okay. We do have a couple of folks on the queue. Fabian, you're up next.
Okay.
Wonderful. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. It was illuminating. This is more or less what my dissertation is on, so I'm going to be somewhat self-serving and ask questions about my stuff. But so my question very simply is whether Plato would actually more or less agree with your characterization here. And if he does, or if he doesn't, more particularly if he doesn't, what would that say about your interpretation in general? And the thought here is essentially that well, there's two kinds of thoughts. Is that one, Plato doesn't really follow Socrates' therapeutic method. He writes dialogues, he teaches in the academy, etc. And he's writing dialogues about Socrates doing the therapeutic method. And the second thought is that Plato has a couple criticisms of Socrates' therapeutic method in his dialogue. So in the Republic, it's in 538, I think. He has an example of someone coming to Callipolis and asking people, what is the fine, and so on and so forth. And Socrates basically says that you can't allow those kinds of people in the city because they destabilize, and they for people who don't know what actually is right or not, then it might actually lead them to do bad things. So regardless, it ends up being bad for the city. There's also the part in the Sophist that you mentioned that that's the therapeutic method is the beginnings of philosophy, but you also need knowledge of virtue to kind of back that up. And my dissertation is on the Cleitophon, which is a criticism of Cleitophon, or from Cleitophon to Socrates, saying that if Socrates is actually going to inspire you to seek after virtue, then he should also kind of give you virtue in a sense. And he doesn't, because Socrates lacks the knowledge of virtue, and therefore might actually be doing a disservice to Cleitophon, because after all, Cleitophon goes off to work with Thrasymachus. And to give a basic analogy to what I'm getting at is that Socrates might be like a healthy person, but a healthy person doesn't make a good doctor. So I could like eat my vegetables and so on and so forth. But if someone has, I don't know, a digestion problem or something like that, maybe vegetables are not the right kinds of things to eat. So we actually need someone who knows about health and about how health applies to every given person, not just oneself, to actually treat people. So elenchus might work for Socrates, but it doesn't necessarily work for Cleitophon, or it doesn't necessarily work for Callicles, and so on and so forth, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I think I agree with a lot of what you're saying here. I do think that Plato, there are criticisms of Socratic method in the middle dialogues and late, I think. Yeah, and I agree agree with that. In the Republic, there's some places where he criticizes, looks like intellectualism straight out. He has Socrates do this, ironically. By the way, just in case you missed this, I mean, this is kind of widely held by people who hold this developmental view of Plato, although there are people who don't think that Plato's didn't change his mind about anything important, but a lot of people think he did. That Republic 1 is a very Socratic dialogue, and some people think that it might have been written as a freestanding dialogue, and then Plato said, hey, this would be a great introduction to my magnum opus, or something like this, whether he did that or not. Book 1 is Socratic, but after that, it's not Socratic at all, and it includes criticisms of Socratic method, especially I think book 6 is one good place. And book 4, after all, just the three-part soul is incompatible with this model of soul that Socrates has, where now we can have conflicts within the soul that are not logical conflicts. So I take it that he's moving beyond that, yes, and I think I certainly would agree with what you said about all of this. One other thing, though, I would say, just relative to your talk about is Socrates virtuous kind of question. I think there's no question he lived a virtuous life. The question is, did philosophy lead him to it? That's where I pull out the Crito and I say, here's somebody telling you, hey, Socrates should break out of jail. His friend comes in, and of course he has a vested interest in getting out of jail because he could survive. And he refuses. Well, he goes through this whole it's a very logical series of questions. Here's a couple of principles. It's never right to do wrong. And from that, he deduces that he shouldn't break out of prison. And it's all logical, one step after another. And it's a philosophical argument for why not to break out of prison. So I take it that whatever, if there was no other good evidence, there's strong evidence that that what's behind Socrates' moral choices is a process of reasoning driven by some sort of moral axioms, and that he sees himself certainly as a rational, person making moral choices and living a moral life by reason, not by tradition or religion or faith or something else, but by reason itself, which I think he thinks is compatible with piety, etc., in the Euthyphro, but doesn't originate from there. But thank you, great question.
Charlie?
Oh, thanks, Dan. What a great talk, and what a great topic for a group such as this, to go back to Socrates. So what you were just saying there in response to Fabian connects with what I wanted to ask about, which is the early Socrates also seems to think that he's got this special voice that he hears, the daimon, right? The special thing that tells him when he's doing something wrong. And it makes me wonder whether the view that you've been advancing, and very powerfully with the appeal to the Credo there, is that, well, all of us fundamentally have some very important beliefs that have to do with morality. And if we're just consistent with those, we'll get everything right, basically, right? Well, it'll be impossible to be wrong and be consistent. But here's another view. There's something special about Socrates. He just can't possibly meet somebody who is, consistent and who disagrees with Socrates, because Socrates has a special pipeline to the truth or something like that. And there's, some indications of that with the references to the daimon. So I just thought I'd ask you to comment on that.
Yeah, well, another great question. I do think that the daimon does supply him with a kind of notion of revelation or something like that. But he does say that, he points out in a certain sense that he thinks the daimon comes in when he can't answer problems for himself or something. He sort of supplies the area where reason is inadequate to do things. And he seems to think that when reason can tell us how to behave, we shouldn't go to the Oracle of Delphi or whatever. We should just consult our reason on this. But it doesn't tell us everything we need to know. And there are lots of cases where he seems to have actually, been influenced by, this feeling he should do this or not do that and so forth. And he says in the apology that he wasn't stopped in the way he was defending himself, so he thinks it was the right way to do. So again, this is a sort of thing he wouldn't know for sure, but etc. Let me just say one other thing that, since you mentioned this, that I find quite striking. I mean, I don't know if you've seen this, but I've used this in classes and stuff. There's these marvelous examples where you get together roughly 2-year-olds and so forth, and do this experiment, and you show a puppet that's a mean puppet and a nice puppet. One of them is nasty, and then they ask the child which puppet that they'd like to have, and it's always the nice puppet. And so, I mean, this is before you're even verbal and you can learn this stuff. But there's a growing body of evidence that little children, younger than 2 years actually, they've been below 2 years, have a strong preference for, people who are nice to each other, who are just and fair to each other, and they're, sometimes they'll punch out the puppet that is mean. It's sort of like. It's like, yes, we already know what's good and bad. It's like there's empirical evidence done with these experiments on toddlers as to what it's all about. And I think Socrates says, see, I should have told you so. I'd like to have my own idea of what he thinks, how he thinks we get these true, value judgments. I haven't found anything that convinces me that he has, I think he thinks we have it. I don't know if he has an explanation of how these ideas came to us. So that's a gap in the story. But I do think that there's empirical evidence that it's true of all things.
Nice. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. I'd like to be respectful of everyone's time, but we did have one more question from my colleague, Kirk, if you'd like to take a moment. Last question of the day.
Great.
Well, I'll make it really quick. Really enjoyed your talk, Dan, and it made me think of some of the final words in the Crito where Socrates says, hey, I can't hear you anymore because the Corybants are, these arguments are like Corybants playing in my ear. And if we recall that music was used as medicine and therapy in the classical world, you see there almost a direct swapping of the therapeutic music and ritualistic approach to therapy to the logos becoming a new therapy. And so that seems to be an explicit place where Socrates invokes the very idea that you're referencing. And I'll talk to you about the other things I have to say some other time.
Okay. Yeah, the Charmides too has some, medical, playfulness, but references too, obviously. We probably can think of several more. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's please
thank you to everybody. I appreciate your help, and good to see you all, a lot of old friends, and hope you all take care, and thanks again.
Thank you all so much for coming to the conference.
Yeah, very good. All right. Bye-bye. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks,
Stay
everybody.
well.
Goodbye.